The flood myth in the world. A flood myth or deluge myth is a narrative in which a great flood, usually sent by a deity or deities, destroys civilization, often in an act of divine retribution. Parallels are often drawn between the flood waters of these myths and the primeval waters found in certain creation myths, as the flood waters are described as a measure for the cleansing of humanity, in preparation for rebirth. Most flood myths also contain a culture hero, who represents the human craving for life. The flood myth motif is found among many cultures as seen in the Mesopotamian flood stories, Deucalion and Pyrrha in Greek mythology, the Genesis flood narrative, Pralaya in Hinduism, the Gunyu in Chinese mythology, Bergelmir in Norse mythology, in the lore of the Quichean Maya peoples in Mesoamerica, the Lac-Cortorea Ojibwa tribe of Native Americans in North America, the Muisca and Canary Confederation, in South America, Africa, and the Aboriginal tribes in southern Australia. Though the account of Noah in the Hebrew Bible has long been the most studied flood story by scholars, in the 19th century Assyriologist George Smith translated the first Babylonian account of a great flood. Further discoveries produced several versions of the Mesopotamian flood myth, with the account closest to that in Genesis found in a 700 BC Babylonian copy of the Epic of Gilgamesh. 20 to 27 The known versions of the Mesopotamian flood myths have as their protagonists Atrahasis, in the 18th century BC Atrahasis epic, Ziusudra, in the 17th century BC Sumerian flood story, and Utnapishtim, in the 7th century BC Gilgamesh flood myth. The Sumerian king list relies on the flood motif to divide its history into pre-flood, antediluvian, and post-flood periods. The pre-flood kings had enormous lifespans, whereas post-flood lifespans were much reduced. The Sumerian flood myth found in the Deluge tablet was the Epic of Ziusudra, who heard the gods' plan to destroy humanity, in response to which he constructed a vessel that delivered him from great waters. In the more detailed Mesopotamian accounts of the flood, the Gilgamesh flood myth and the Epic of Atrahasis, the highest god Enlil decides to destroy the world with a flood because humans have become too noisy. Ea, who created humans out of clay and divine blood, secretly warns the hero Utnapishtim of the impending flood and gives him detailed instructions for building a boat so that life may survive. In the circa 6th century BC Book of Genesis, the god Yahweh, who created man out of clay, decides to flood the earth because of the sinful state of mankind. It is also Yahweh who then gives the protagonist Noah instructions to build an ark in order to preserve human and animal life. When the ark is completed, Noah, his family, and representatives of all the animals of the earth are called upon to enter the ark. When the destructive flood begins, all life outside of the ark perishes. After the waters recede, all those aboard the ark disembark and have Yahweh's promise that he will never judge the earth with a flood again. He causes a rainbow to form as the sign of this promise. In Hindu mythology, texts such as the Satapatha Brahmana, dated to around the 6th century BC, and the Puranas contain the story of a great flood, Pralaya, wherein the Matsya avatar of the Vishnu warns the first man, Manu, of the impending flood, and also advises him to build a giant boat.